Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. Now, as a journalist, and as many of the people watching this are probably journalists as well and or working in the media or politics, we know that holding respective governments around the world to account is extremely important, be it through freedom of information requests or otherwise. We now have proposed changes in the UK to the Official Secrets Act, as it's called, which many people, including one of our panelists who is joining us today, have criticized as possibly then being against press freedoms in that country. That would certainly obviously also then set a very dangerous precedent going forward. This is at a time when we've also had a lot of controversy about the right to then protest in the UK and the attempt by the government to try to limit that right as well, at least in the eyes of critics. Now, a UK journalist could be imprisoned for around 14 years for publishing leaked files under this proposed changes to the Official Secrets Act. They may even be treated as quote-unquote foreign spies, which is an extremely disturbing equal sign to then put between journalist and foreign spy as a journalist who is seeking to just ensure transparency in whatever happens behind the scenes in government. Let's discuss those issues and others a bit further. I'm joined by Dr. Karin Jorgensen, who is a professor at the School of Journalism, Media and Culture. She's also Dean of Research of Environment and Culture at Cardiff University. She's joining us today from Cardiff. Joining us from London is Dr. Tim Crook, who is an Emeritus Professor at the Department of Media, Communications and Cultural Studies. He's a historian at Goldsmith at the University of London and is president of the Chartered Institute of Journalists. Tim and Karin, thank you both for taking our time out of your busy schedules to join us today. Karin, I'll start with you because I know that you wrote a piece about this very issue in the conversation. Just if you can briefly, if I can start for just this term foreign spies, which has been going to be used possibly within this act and bill towards journalists. What do you make of that argument?
Well, I think that what's very dangerous about this proposed change in the law is that it effectively criminalizes journalists by breaking down any distinctions between journalists and spies. So the consultation document says that the Home Office does not consider that there's necessarily a distinction in severity between espionage and the most serious unauthorized disclosures. And as we know, those of us who are journalists in particular, a lot of hard-hitting investigative journalism is based on precisely such unauthorized disclosures. So basically, the proposed reform amounts to an assault on investigative journalism.
Tim, many would say, many of the cynics would say, I think, that, listen, the way Julian Assange was treated, the way that Edward Snowden was treated, that this is not a complete surprise that enough journalists at that time did not create the kind of chaos that should have been created in reaction to that. What would you say to that? Were their cases sort of or emblematic, possibly, of what was to come down the road?
I think this represents the British state winning on the attack on journalism sources. They already have a wide range of legal weapons to effectively criminalize and terrorize public officials from talking to journalists. They replaced a discredited part of the old Official Secrets Act, Section 2, which made it a criminal offense to say anything to a journalist that was, information gathered during the course of work. That was a complete failure. It was taken off the statute book in 1989. And what the government did was take a common law offence, misconduct in public office, that's never been put before Parliament, and turn it into a resuscitation of strict liability. If you talk to a journalist, you're a criminal, you will go to jail, no public interest defence. So we're very disappointed. The profession of journalism in the United Kingdom is very, very alarmed. It would appear the Home Office wants to continue the attack now on journalists. The position of Julian Assange, who most professional journalists regard as a very important source par excellence, communicating in the new digital platform. It's an astonishing situation that he remains in prison for no actual conviction relating to his role as a source.
Yeah.
It's quite bizarre. And really, the Home Office is trying it on. The Law Commission, which is set up to make proposals to reform law, initially they didn't have a public interest defence in the new form of Official Secrets Act. They were persuaded to put it in November last year, and the Home Office is ignoring that.
If I may for a moment just play devil's advocate, right? The argument on the part of government, as I've understood it, and you can correct me if I'm wrong in saying this or paraphrasing it this way, would be that, listen, there are times when there are certain secrets that should not, in fact, come out into the public eye, and those would then be a matter of actual national security and would hurt homeland security as well in the UK. And that was, I know, the argument that was made, for example, in the US during the time of Snowden as well. How do you respond to those arguments?
Well, I think that it is very concerning around this new piece of legislation that it in fact removes the need for the Home Office to actually prove that any disclosures have caused real damage to national security, because it says that these are barriers to potential prosecutions. So rather than this being a case for prosecuting on the basis of disclosures which really damage national security, this is a case of actually really kind of driving down any barriers to prosecution, including prosecution of journalists and their sources, the kinds of whistleblowers who have typically provided the information needed for these disclosures to happen. So for me, there's a very concerning move towards removing the need to actually show what is going on in terms of the importance for national security of these disclosures. And at the same time, I think we should also see this in the context of a broader process of what scholars have called securitization, whereby national security arguments are used as a basis for justifying crackdown on all kinds of civil liberties, and including the freedom of the press. So there are many, many concerning elements in this bit of proposed legislation, which to my mind really kind of question the intent behind this bill.
Tim, if I may continue that argument that I made to Karin there, the argument still would be that there have been times, and there will be times in the future, where certain specific journalists may very well cross that fine red line into territory which then does hurt national security, homeland security. What does and how can one then reel somebody like that in?
Sadly, there have been cases, and there may well be cases, of journalists who do act as agents for foreign powers and engage in espionage. They're very rare. They are prepared to support terrorism and so on. But the existing Official Secrets Act 1989, which doesn't have what is generally regarded as a public interest defense, as the honored distinguished guest has explained, sets up an objective standpoint for proof. A court has to be convinced, particularly the jury, that the leaker and the journalist knew that the information was damaging to specific categories of national security. I think the United Kingdom state has realized that that high threshold hasn't been working. They can't get convictions easily. They very, very rarely prosecute under the, quote, Official Secrets Act, unquote, because it's seen as, and fundamentally it makes a terrible mistake of confusing everyday journalism, leaking stories that are embarrassing to government, with espionage and spying. They are discrete, distinguishable areas of problem. The Chartered Institute of Journalists believes that leaking in the public interest, in terms of sanctions, that belongs to the civil area of the law, employment law. If there's any comeback, then it should be a matter of disciplining, losing a job and rights. It should not be criminalized.
Right.
In conclusion, you're right. There are senses when there is a threat to what used to be called the defense of the realm, national security. And if the government wants to get this right, then they would do well to separate public interest journalism, whistleblowing from threats to national security. If they do that, then they'll avoid in the future having very embarrassing trials that go wrong, where journalists are acquitted. The decision to prosecute is seen as politically malicious, and wrongly using the idea of the spy to discredit and demonize.
Karin, I'm going to give a final word before I let both yourself and Tim go. I'm wondering then, and this word, the C word, which all of us in media and as journalists hate, but the censorship word. Do you think that now we will have journalists censoring themselves? And what does that then mean for the profession of journalism and public knowledge of things that citizens should know about?
Well, I think that this legislation, if it's passed, will undoubtedly have a chilling effect on journalism. We've seen that in many other countries where there's been legislative crackdown on journalistic practices through these kinds of means. What's likely to happen is that whistleblowers are going to be less likely to come forward with disclosures, and that equally journalists will be concerned about the fate of their sources and indeed their own fates in terms of the possible very lengthy prison sentences of up to 14 years, and also the lowered criteria in terms of the burden of proof. I think that this is going to have a very negative impact in terms of leaks that are in the public interest no longer coming out. And I think that we should see this, as your other commentator also mentioned, as part of a broader kind of legislative drive on the part of Priti Patel's Home Office to really limit civil liberties. So I think that we need to be worried about increased authoritarian creep in the United Kingdom, and we need to be worried about the rights of individual citizens, but also more specifically about the freedom of the press.
We'll leave there at that, but we really appreciate both Karin and Tim for taking their time out and for really putting this into context for us, this issue of how worrying then the Official Secrets Act, the changes to the Official Secrets Act are, the proposed changes on the part of Priti Patel and the UK government that is currently in office. As I said, for a journalist to be called a spy for 99.9% of journalists is probably a major overstatement. But yes, as Tim there mentioned, there are journalists who do cross the red line. And yes, there are constraints that right now do exist to hold such people accountable. But why then is the Home Office, why is the UK government going down this path? As I mentioned in my introduction, we've already had this very controversial law against the right to protest, and now press freedoms are under attack. Which way is Boris Johnson's government going, and why? Those are really open-ended and important questions. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, in the second segment of today's show, we're going to discuss a congressional letter signed by 25 Democrats, including Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, who's one of the congresswomen who's leading this effort, has called on the State Department, the U.S. State Department, to appoint an envoy to fight Islamophobia, global Islamophobia, so not just limited to the United States itself. The letter goes on to say that, that the issue of anti-Muslim bigotry is a genuine global problem. Of course, I'm paraphrasing the words there, and cites, in fact, the annual report of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, which then did highlight the mistreatment and human rights violations against Muslims. Globally, is this a solution? Would this be a solution? Appointing an envoy, I mean, it would certainly be a very important symbolic move to have an entire diplomatic office geared towards resolving the issue of international Islamophobia. let's put those questions now to our panelists who are joining us this morning from the United States. We're joined now by Dr. Nazia Kazi, who is joining us from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. She's an associate professor of anthropology at Stockton University. Joining us from Detroit, Michigan, is Dr. Saeed Khan, who is a senior lecturer in Near East and Asian Studies and Global Studies at Wayne State University. Saeed and Nazia, good morning to you both, and thank you both for joining us. Nazia, let me start with you. Let me play the cynical angle for a moment. Is an envoy in and of itself, herself or himself, depending on who it would be, would that be a solution to the issue of Islamophobia? I mean, I really wonder if this is the best way to go about doing this.
I share your concerns. And, you know, I mean, if we really think carefully about this, let's take the greatest purveyor of military violence around the world, especially in Muslim majority countries, that is the US, and put that entity in charge of enforcing anti-Islamophobia measures around the world. What could go wrong? I too ask cynically. You know, I mean, the thing is, we have to be really careful when we are talking about combating Islamophobia, especially when here I sit at the heart of US empire. It can take on some very decontextualized and cynical meanings. We've seen in the US a very cynical drumming up of this concept of Islamophobia as the US ramps up its economic and sort of psychological warfare against China. We need to be really savvy about these kinds of manipulations of the very term Islamophobia. So while I think, you know, efforts to combat Islamophobia are frequently very well-intentioned and meant to join a growing body of American anti-racism, we have to be really careful when we think about making the U.S. the enforcer of anti-Islamophobia measures globally.
Yeah. Saeed, you know, what are your thoughts about what Nazia there said? I mean, I would think that for the U.S. to, in fact, support such an envoy on the part of the United Nations, like more specifically just for Islamophobia, would be a more logical move. What do you think? What do you think about that?
Well, that's wrought with a few problems, Waqar, because, I mean, as we know, unfortunately, the United Nations doesn't have much of an enforcement mechanism. So it runs the danger of it being even more symbolic. But I echo Nazia's concerns about this current posture. Remember that this is essentially intended to mirror an existing office within the State Department, which is the Special Envoy to combat and monitor anti-Semitism around the world. And I would say that there's really two issues here. One is, are these going to be taken as central policy issues when it comes to Americans and America's diplomatic wing, which is what the State Department is? Second concern that I have is that it inadvertently falls into a trap which the United States tends to do when it comes to Muslims. By putting this office in the State Department, well-intended as though it might possibly be, and certainly something that is being advocated by not only Representative Ilhan Omar and the two other Muslim Americans in Congress, Andre Carson and Rashida Tlaib, but a broader cadre, including Debbie Dingell, congressperson here from Michigan, and others, that it is simply foreignizing or otherizing Muslims yet again. And it echoes some of the mishaps that occur with the U.S. government. For example, having an iftar dinner at the State Department and seemingly making it, for the optics, appear as though Islam is simply just a foreign entity, without taking into account the fact that there's millions of Muslims here. And that then brings that question up. What about Islamophobia in the United States? Is it not a domestic issue? Perhaps what would be a better strategy then, and perhaps more pressing for Muslim Americans, where something perhaps could be done substantively, is have a dedicated office within the Department of Justice, where it seems as though there's a far dire need with the rampant increase in hate crimes and anti-Muslim bigotry in the United States.
It's a really good point that Saeed made there, didn't you, Nazia? Because the U.S., whether we like it or not, does create precedents for the rest of us around the world, right? So if we have Islamophobia within the U.S. and the U.S. tells another country, listen, you should not be Islamophobic towards your respective Muslim citizens, that then loses, I mean, the U.S. loses major moral authority within that argument, right? Why isn't and why aren't these lawmakers, do you think, concentrating, as Saeed there said, upon the very internal issues that exist in this regard?
I think the real trouble here stems from how we define Islamophobia. In the US, there's this troubling tendency to understand racism as individual acts of bigotry, as personalized, attitudinal kind of acts of prejudice, individual hate crimes. And, one of the things I have written about in my book, and I'm quick to remind my students, is that one of the greatest, I think, acts of Islamophobia was the US's 2003 invasion of Iraq. But we often don't have this kind of systemic understanding of racism in the US, and it leads us to some troubling places. It leads us to a place where then we think if we can detect individual bigots, if we can catch people who are filled with hatred, then we can, stamp out the problem. But that is the problem itself. I mean, the problem is that Islamophobia is a systemic project of U.S. empire building, right? I mean, just before jumping on this show, I saw that an additional $25 billion has been allocated to the U.S. military, which is already about $800 billion in its funding. Now, how do we make sense of that when the U.S. military apparatus itself has been guilty of some of the most heinous forms of violence in the so-called Muslim world? Yeah. But unfortunately, these are the questions that do not get asked when we conceptualize Islamophobia or other forms of racism as these kinds of personalized individual animus.
Saeed, I'll give you the final word. It's a question then of having the ability to ask the tough questions of yourself, right, and of your own society and nation. Is the U.S. not prepared to do that? I mean, this is at the same time that the U.S. has said that the United Nations can come in and investigate racism in the country. So in some ways, the argument can be, low, actually, under Biden, we're opening up and we're willing to accept our mistakes. I mean, do you think that that would extend to Islamophobia?
It's unlikely, and part of the reason is the United States, if we recall, has also blocked efforts by the international criminal courts to investigate various acts that have been perpetrated by the U.S. But I think that it's important to understand structurally that this office is an undersecretary position. It's under the actual Secretary of State, who simply is going to be enacting and forwarding and advancing U.S. policy overseas. I'm afraid that this is going to be seen as a very uneven, imbalanced, and disproportionate allocation of demands to combat Islamophobia. For example, right now we can certainly imagine that all eyes are trained on China, but it'll be interesting to see if anything is said against India, where there is state policy, of course, that is demonizing and discriminating against an entire Muslim population there. Economics plays a very big role. Geopolitics plays a very big role in the American calculus, and it seems as though Islamophobia then is going to be tainted by the fact that it is going to be politicized.
Indeed. Well, we'll leave there at that. A great conversation. We really appreciate Nazia and Saeed for taking their time out this morning, speaking to us from Philadelphia and Detroit, respectively. We were discussing there the setting up, or at least the proposal in a letter by 25 Democrats to Secretary Blinken, who is the U.S. Secretary of State, as we well know, to set up an office within the State Department to have an envoy for global Islamophobia. Would this just be a political tool in some way, as our guests there alluded to, or would this be an actual effort to genuinely both self-reflect and help the world, overcome such hatred overall towards Muslims, which is expressed in many various ways, a terror attack such as Christchurch or in other such forms as well. Obviously, there's much room to be pessimistic considering the track record here and considering that probably, if we're completely honest, this will be just used as a political tool against other countries where, yes, there are issues against Muslims, but what of then the U.S. itself? Why can't it deal with its own issues first as an example for the rest of the world? I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In the final segment of today's show, we're going to discuss this huge Pegasus scandal of surveillance. And, of course, a lot of privacy rights experts are up in arms, as many around the world have been affected by this latest scandal. Officials, activists, people from all walks of life, really, throughout the world. Now, the Pegasus scandal goes back again to Israel's military technology industry, which includes its renowned intelligence technology on cyber tools and cyber warfare, which Israel then has been exporting to many countries around the world, even those who would be considered quote-unquote authoritarian regimes. But in this conversation, we're going to try to hone in on the fact that why does Israel allow for this? I know that Israel has now set up a commission, or is setting up a commission, to look into the continuous allegations that come up against its companies that are then selling such technology, because this is not the first such scandal, certainly, that has become public. Let's discuss this a bit further. We're now joined by Dr. Donald Lossman, who is a retired lecturer in international affairs at the School of International Affairs at George Washington University. He's joining us this morning from Arlington, Virginia. Donald, thank you very much for joining us this morning. Good morning to you. What do you make, Donald, if I may hone in on just why Israel does even export such technology? The argument on the Israeli side has been that, listen, we're not responsible for how another country may use this technology. But nevertheless, after so many scandals in a row, you would think that they would be looking themselves in the mirror and questioning if this is smart to continue doing?
Well, I'm sure Israel is asking itself that question right now as to how they got in the market and started. This cyber security market is part of a global arms trade, so to speak, a larger one. Traditionally, it's been in hardware, planes and tanks and bullets. But with the rise of technology, the ability to spy and gain information through cyber means is very important. And it just so happens that there are many, many demanders in the world, so many governments that want this information and this capability. Israel, because it was attacked at the birth of its nation and had been through many, many wars, tried to develop internal defense capabilities. And as technology evolved, they felt they needed to develop cyber capabilities. So their industry got seed money from the government. They have the capabilities. A lot of Israel Defense Force personnel and intelligence agency personnel, when they retired, formed these companies. And they're one of many participating companies in this large market. They seem, however, to be pretty good. And all the facts are not in yet as to how this thing will actually play out, but we certainly have a storm.
Yeah.
Those
so if I may then for a moment, Don, on this question of the storm then, right? What do you think should happen next? I mean, I would think that the logical step is certainly there needs to be a lot better, filtering out of those who should or should not be getting such technology. I mean, that seems like a no-brainer. But then beyond that, the argument that, listen, whichever government or whichever entity out there would want such technology will be able to get it. I mean, that's an argument that's been, I've heard over the number of days ever since this latest scandal came out. But it's still a question then of the fact that Israel says it's the only democracy in the Middle East, sure, but then for it to then be involved in this, then says, hey, the democracies are fine with then giving this sort of technology out, and for then the abuse of privacy and surveillance, et cetera?
Well, I would say that democracies, and Israel in particular in this case, are also economies. And in Israel's case, it's a small country, it needs foreign exchange, needs export revenues, and probably for diplomatic reasons, as the government has okayed sales of this Pegasus system, because some of the buyers might feel more kindly in their relationships with Israel. But this is a tough issue of international morals and what can be allowed and what cannot be allowed. And supposedly it's supposed to all be undercover, so none of this gets out. But it's a very difficult thing. All countries are spying on all other countries. That's what intelligence agencies do. How, when discovered, they end up pacifying their accusers is a different story. It may well be. First, I would say is that all sales by the Israeli companies in this regard are approved by the government and the foreign ministry department. So presumably the buyers are vetted to be appropriate countries which would use in the appropriate fashion, and they sign contracts in this regard. However, once the technology gets out there, the buyer can, of course, do almost anything it wants. And according to NSO, when it has discovered this, it has terminated contracts. And presumably, again, according to them, they have vetted many potential government buyers and rejected maybe millions of dollars of contracts, and have limited the purchases to about 50 countries.
Yeah.
So
then, Don, is then the real issue, as you correctly put it there, the economic factor is an extremely important one. I do not want to downplay that. So is that then just the sad reality of today's world? Because even if we're talking about arms sales, because it's not very different from what we're talking about right now. I mean, spyware can also be seen as a form of warfare. I mean, in a sense, right? Cyber warfare at the very least, or a cyber tool of warfare. Do you think that the reality of today's world is that those equations of human rights versus economic interests are just extremely tough, even for democracies to resolve?
They are extremely tough, and it's not just economic interests, it's national security interests as well. And until we have some clear international standards, which means most countries coming together on a common role of what can and what cannot be done, and I think that's kind of unlikely. This is going to continue on. And as long as governments want information, it's going to continue on. And it doesn't make a difference whether it's Israeli suppliers or other suppliers. And there are many countries in this market that have companies that are doing this exact kind of thing.
Right. Okay, so let's add another voice to the conversation. We're now joined by Dr. Lee W. McKnight, who is an associate professor of information studies at Syracuse University. He's joining us this morning from Syracuse, New York. Lee, thank you for taking your time out this morning to join us. What are your thoughts on the Pegasus scandal, on military technology of this sort as a cyber tool / cyber warfare tool, and its use in this regard, where the argument on the Israeli side is that we're not responsible for how the parties that are buying this technology from us use it?
Yes, well, it's essentially the same exact capabilities as the illicit groups that operate and deploy ransomware or remotely take over your computer to hold your organization hostage. Essentially, it's the same capabilities, but packaged for the specific purpose, in this case of, listening in and exfiltrating information from people's personal devices. So on one hand, technically, it is not that complicated in terms of the capabilities of modern governments and also obviously private enterprises such as NSO Group. And on the other, it's of course quite disturbing when companies that try to do this wearing a white hat, supposedly, as labeling this as something legitimate, and claiming they are very careful in their selection of customers. We find out how widely deployed this particular system is in so many countries and on so many prominent leaders and human rights activists and others.
I know this is a heavy question, Lee, but does this in some ways then hurt moral authority on the part of many of these democracies? Because as I was discussing with Don, our other expert with us on the panel today, is that, there is this very tough debate that happens in democracies between safeguarding human rights around the world and also then ensuring their economic interests are preserved.
So what's the same level of, I guess you might say, hypocrisy or moral, righteousness that led to many people being upset and scandalized when Edward Snowden's revelations were released. This would be another example of that. But the reality is, nation states have been spying on other nation states. and polite society has been polite society all along. So I see this as just one aspect of the the crafts of modern states. And in the case, and specifically for NSO, it's, does NSA need NSO tools? The National Security Agency of the United States? Does does China or Russia need these tools? Actually, probably not, because they have such highly skilled, or North Korea for that matter. So some of the most sophisticated nations don't need this commercial product because they have their own internally developed systems, I suppose. I don't have any access to classified information.
Yeah.
So I think it's just a reality that some people are shocked by this kind of thing when it comes into the open, but it's just an ongoing aspect of statecraft.
Lee, I'll give you the final word before I let both of you go. What is the lesson for the rest of us, and those who are not activists necessarily, or government officials who have not been affected by this, at least to the best of our knowledge, at least, or we're not on any lists for now? Is it just as we've always known that, listen, you've never ever had, or we've never really ever had privacy online anyways?
Well, there's the limitation. I mean, for all of us, and the truth is, when we are online, by definition, we're connecting devices, we're connecting resources, and guess what? Other people are either intentionally assisting or are able to intrude on that information, or without our permission, without our authorization as well. So there definitely are real limits. But there are also there's more advanced technology. I'll say the word blockchain. There's ways to approach, and there's more secure devices. So it's kind of a trade-off that we have these mass devices that are readily available, but are also not that difficult for NSO Group to sort of remotely take over and manipulate along with other companies such as them.
We'll leave it there at that. We really appreciate Lee and Donald for taking their time out this morning to speak to us there from Syracuse and Arlington, respectively. We were discussing there the Pegasus scandal, what it then means, economic interests versus human rights safeguards, democracies thrown into the middle of this, moral authority, moral hypocrisy. These are really heavy themes and heavy debates, but they're really important because what is the reality of the world that we're living in? It's an ugly truth that maybe really no one has moral authority, even though everybody or all of the above continue to claim that they do against all others. If you're doing exactly the same thing that adversaries do to you, and you create a ruckus about what they do to you, but you're expecting them not to do the same when you do the same to them, then there's sort of that double standard there, isn't it? So is the lesson for the rest of us, as I put to Lee right at the end, the fact that there has never really been privacy, even though we may be told over and over again that, listen, there's encryption, et cetera, but there are ways around that. As NSO has proven, and as many other such scandals have proven as well. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.